Sorry for the wait. Good evening, I'm David Remnick of the New Yorker magazine. It's always a privilege for our magazine to work together with Penn, and never more so than this evening. It's also a privilege, I have to say, to see a line stretching from the front door of Town Hall to the chili joint on Times Square. Tonight's event is just one in a week-long series of readings and public discussions, an international festival of literature featuring over 100 writers. I'd like to thank our 9 readers for the evening, some of whom have traveled quite long to get here, and also Michael Roberts of Penn and Penn's remarkable president, Salman Rushdie. The subject of the night, in whatever way our writers choose to approach it, directly, obliquely, or otherwise, through readings or speeches written for the occasion, is the power of the pen, no pen intended. An editor should have known better. The proposition of whether literature changes anything is probably too easily answered in the affirmative and too sonorous and broad to refute. The question is how, at what level, does literature change anything? There are many angles of approach to this question, and I'd only suggest a few. First, perhaps, there is the sociological problem. That is, how many people are there really who still avail themselves of literature and its power? This is a room full of readers, and yet the demands on our attention, private and collective, the way we yield our attention, the coarsening of our entertainments has all deepened, and perhaps not to the benefit of literature. Several years ago, when The Human Stain was about to be published, Philip Roth remarked, "Every year, 70 readers die, and only 2 replace them." That's a very easy way to visualize it, he said. The evidence is everywhere that the literary era has come to an end, he went on. The evidence is the culture. The evidence is the society. The evidence is the screen, the progression from the movie screen to the television screen to the computer. There's only so much time, so much room, and there are only so many habits of mind that can determine how people use the free time that they do have. Literature takes a habit of mind that has disappeared. It requires silence, some form of isolation, and sustained concentration in the presence of an enigmatic thing. It is difficult to come to grips with a mature, intelligent, adult novel. It is difficult to know what to make of literature, unquote. So there's that. How many care to put themselves in the presence of what Roth calls an enigmatic thing? Second, there is the political approach. We know that in dictatorships, in countries without, as Penn puts it, freedom to read, literature has such pronounced capacities to challenge a regime that the dictator and his agencies actively seek to destroy the writer through censorship, imprisonment, exile, or even death. In such societies, societies without journalism, without even a modicum of truth told about the political and public realm, imaginative literature is drafted out of necessity to take the place of journalism. And where pravda speaks no pravda, no truth, poems, songs, stories, and novels take on the added role, whether the imaginative writer likes it or not, of telling the news, recent or distant. The examples of this are countless. Akhmatova, Brodsky, Sinyavsky, Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union, even Nabokov, in a novel as hilarious and apolitical seeming as Pnin, cannot help but tell the news, persistently denied at that time, of his exiled country's secret system of oppression, from which kindly Pnin makes his escape to the groves of New England academe. The list goes on. Miloš in Poland, Kundera and Havel in Czechoslovakia, the late Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria. And since we live in a boundaryless world, Salman Rushdie in Iran and beyond. In all of these cases, the dictator fears the writer's capacity to undermine him, to write true histories, to describe the absurdity of the political system, to question even the orthodoxies of authoritarian religion. And yet it is also worth noting that in these cases, the writer in question yearns for an imperfect liberalism in which literature loses the demand on it for historical truth, for pravda, and is no longer a form of journalism or placard waving. It is liberated to do what it wants. Finally, in the imperfect liberal realm in which we live, There's the question of what, if anything, literature can change. Perhaps the most misunderstood, misread line in modern poetry comes from Auden's elegy for Yeats, for poetry makes nothing happen. Airlifted out of the poem itself, the line seems to suggest a passivity, a recreation, poetry as a minor key irrelevance. The contrary is the case. The earlier lines speak of the death of Yeats and insists on the persistence of his language and its capacity to change the reader. He writes of Yeats, now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. The idea being that the imaginings and the language of the great writers and poets anywhere, inhabit the reader and persist over time. Or as Joseph Brodsky, who memorized Auden in a prison camp, writes, what is left of a man is a part of speech.
Okay, I have to block out the dire situation David just described, and of course they are true, but as a writer, one has to be kind of idealistic, and as Conrad said, one has to dream alone, and have to be some kind of dreamer. But the poem David just mentioned, I think, in fact, also echo in my mind since I saw this topic. There's another line in that poem that is, you are silly like us, your gift survive it all. I think by your gift, Auden refers to the poetry written by Yeats. The poetry has its own integrity and autonomy that cannot be tempered by history and politics. I think it is this kind of autonomy and integrity that give the power to survive. By that function and the ability to survive, from that function comes the power or the ability to preserve human experiences. I think that from these functions, literature does have some kind of power, not a direct impact on the world, but it does have the power to preserve human experience and survive in time. And for me as a writer, I always remember that line, poetry makes nothing happen. And that also means I try to avoid that kind of ambition. I think my ambition would be something like to achieve, let my work achieve some kind of autonomy that originates in history, but is not confined to history. I'm going to read some passages from my first novel, In the Pond. And this is a kind of a negative example about this case. And this is how arts and writing are conceived in purely pragmatic terms. In fact, this book is about a kind of spiritual imprisonment. The protagonist here, in fact, is trapped not only by political oppressions, but also by his own limited vision. And some people said to me, you know, it's a very funny book. For me, this is a kind of sick book. That's kind of, so this is about the sickness. Okay, and the situation here is that he didn't get an apartment that he thought he should have gotten from the factory. He was angry. He tried to write and paint to revenge himself and expose the corruption of the leaders. Choking with anger, he was determined to do something about the injustice. Even though he couldn't correct the leaders' wrongdoing, he wanted to teach them an unforgettable lesson. and showed them that he wouldn't swallow an offense. But what should he do? He remembered that the materialist thinker Wang Chong of the Han Dynasty had said something about punishing the evil with the writing brush. He couldn't recall the exact words. That passage must have been in the paperback, the essence of ancient Chinese thought, which he had read a few weeks before. He stood up and went back into the room. On the top of a wicker bookshelf, the book was sandwiched between an epigraphic dictionary and an emblem of flower paintings. He pulled it out and without difficulty found the passage, since he had folded the bottom corner of the page as a bookmark. He perused Wang Chong's words. How can writing be merely playing with ink and toying with brush? It must record people's deeds and bequeath their names to posterity. The virtuous hope to have their deeds remembered and therefore exert themselves to do more good. The wicked fear having their doings recorded and therefore make efforts to restrain themselves. In brief, the true scholar's brush must encourage good and warn against evil. Being close to the book, profoundly moved, writing and painting belong to the same family of arts, he reasoned. They are both the work of the brush. Yes, to fight the evil is the essential function for fine arts. As an artist and scholar, I ought to expose those corrupt leaders. Whatever they are, painting and writing must not be embroidery and decoration. They must have strength and a soul, a healthy, upright spirit. A good piece of work should be as lethal as a dagger to evildoers. After Meilan and Shanshan, they are his family members. After Meilan and Shanshan went to bed, Bin began to grinding an ink stick in his antique ink slab, which was in the shape of a crab, carved out of a gold star stone. His hand kept moving clockwise in tiny circles. The ink was ready in a few minutes. He picked up a brush made of weasel's hair and began to draw a cartoon. On a large sheet of paper, he drew a huge official seal, standing upright, upside down. Then on the seal's bulky handle, he sketched an ecstatic face with a few hairs on the crown. Up on the seal's flap top, which was in the form of an oval stage, he put a dozen midget men and women sitting together in 2 rows. He made sure that the 2 of them in the center resembled Secretary Liu and Director Ma. Liu, wearing a handlebar mustache, sat with his short arms crossed before his chest, while Ma's long face was pulled downward as though his mouth was filled with food. Behind the human figures, Bin set up a 6-story building with broad balconies and tall windows from which fluorescent rays were darting out. The drawing finished, Bin dipped a small brush in the ink, then wrote a line of bold characters at the top of the paper as the title. Happy is the family with power. The excitement of creating a meaningful piece of work kept him awake after he went to bed. He forced himself to count his heartbeats, which were faster than the second hand of the clock on the wall. His temples were tight and his head wouldn't cool down. Within 2 hours, he got up 3 times to urinate in the outhouse in the west corner of the courtyard. Not until 2 o'clock did he go to sleep. The next morning, he showed the cartoon to his wife. Good, good, she said. I hope this will be a landmine and blast them. Carefully, he stuffed it into a manila envelope addressed to Lü Da Daily, a regional newspaper in which he had published 3 words of calligraphy. On his way to work, he went up Bank Street and dropped the envelope into the mailbox in front of the post office. Thank you.
Does writing change anything? Yes, I deeply believe in it. Without this belief, I couldn't know how to write and couldn't do it. Of course, I'm perfectly aware of the constraints imposed by circumstances, situations, history, and the time we live in. Therefore, my belief, albeit deep, is not absolute nor blind. What is the major limitation? This is a fact that seldom, and only in exceptional cases, writing affects the people and influences the course of the history directly, in a radical and immediate way. Writing has rather indirect effect, sometimes very hard to notice at first sight. It takes time before the readers become aware of its impact, before it starts to form and change their circumstances, thus influencing decisions, attitudes, and deeds. Because writing, to change anything at all, depends less on the authors and more on the audience, the readers, their sensitivity to and the trust in words, their readiness to react and respond to the words they perceive. Let's not forget about this context in which the words are uttered, because the surroundings atmosphere, the spirit of times, and the character of culture also have their importance. But those circumstances which can weaken or even annihilate the value of strengths of the written word are beyond the influence of the author. Nevertheless, in spite of such obstacles, I am convinced that writing can change a great deal. I say this from experience of myself and many of my colleagues who risked and lost their lives when they tried not only to report what's happening in the world, but also to use the information to change the reality, to expose evil, to improve the situation, to make the world a more human place. Here is one of many examples. Since 1959, Rwanda has been torn apart by recurring tribal and caste massacres to which the world was unaware because journalists were not allowed into the country. I tried myself in vain to cross the border many times while staying in neighboring Tanzania. Only reports about the slaughters of 1994 have finally awakened the world opinion, and from that time on, Rwanda has ceased to be a place of bloody mass infernal warfares. It is precisely the act of writing, accusatory, exposing, or simply providing the facts played an important role in the closing down the Gulag and Nazi concentration camps, in the overthrowing of many murderous dictators such as Pol Pot, Mobutu, Idi Amin. And this ability of the written word has been a nightmare of authoritarian powers, which has tried to counter it by every means possible. Hence the burning of books by Nazis, the expelling of writers and their accusations. We cannot imagine a history of any school book to mention not at least in one chapter the role played in various social and political battles and printed materials in the form of leaflets, underground pamphlets, and books. But when we ask, does writing change anything, we usually have in mind a positive change, a step toward a better world. But we should not forget that writing can also attempt to change the world for worse, contribute to the rise of the evil, hatred, and aggression. Such is the rule of writing, full of fanatism and xenophobia, of hate, like the protocols of Zionism and Hitler's Mein Kampf. The question of how to act, of writing relates to change. This question, in my opinion, is very important now. It is a question worth asking precisely today, when reality is putting literature to a new test. It stems from anxiety about the effectiveness of our writing efforts, about the value of writing itself. Because on the one hand, we see the proliferation of words, more and more books, magazines, newspapers. But on the other, we notice how much evil is there in the world, how the number of problems and conflict on the planet is growing rather than decreasing. This leads to the many writers to become skeptical and spread mistrust or even disbelief in the sense of our writing. The mind of contemporary man is so flooded with words that they lose value and power, and they don't tell us much, they confuse and wear us out. But this overload, this excess should not discourage us. Literature has always taken on responsibility. For millennia, it assists consecutive generations and often improves them. And today, nothing can release us from this duty. On the contrary, our difficult times demand that we repeat with a special strength and conviction. Yes, writing can change something for better, even if it is only a little change, but still it can change. Thank you.
Does writing change anything? I took this question literally, and I'm reading two pieces. One about our feeling as writers, which everyone goes through. Probably not, we think sometimes. And the second, with the opposite answer, most likely yes. The first piece is called The Tent. You're in a tent. It's vast and cold outside, very vast, very cold. It's a howling wilderness. There are rocks in it, and ice and sand, and deep boggy pits you could sink into without a trace. There are ruins as well, many ruins. In and around the ruins there are broken musical instruments, old bathtubs, bones of extinct land mammals, shoes minus their feet, auto parts. There are thorny shrubs, gnarled trees, high winds, but you have a small candle in your tent. You can keep warm. Many things are howling out there in the howling wilderness. Many people are howling. Some howl in grief because those they love have died or been killed. Others howl in triumph because they have caused the loved ones of their enemies to die or be killed. Some howl to summon help, some howl for revenge, others howl for blood. The noise is deafening. It's also frightening. Some of the howling is coming close to you in your tent, where you crouch in silence, hoping you won't be seen. You're frightened for yourself, but especially for those you love. You want to protect them. You want to gather them inside your tent for protection. The trouble is, your tent is made of paper. Paper won't keep anything out. You know you must write on the walls, on the paper walls, on the inside of your tent. You must write upside down and backwards. You must cover every available space on the paper with writing. Some of the writing has to describe the howling that's going on outside, night and day, among the sand dunes and the ice chunks and the ruins and bones and so forth. It must tell the truth about the howling, but this is difficult to do because you can't see through the paper walls, and so you can't be exact about the truth, and you don't want to go out there, out into the howling wilderness, to see exactly for yourself. Some of the writing has to be about your loved ones and the need you feel to protect them, and this is difficult as well because not all of them can hear the howling in the same way you do. Some of them think it sounds like a picnic out there in the wilderness, like a big band, like a hot beach party. They resent being cooped up in such a cramped space with you and your small candle and your fearfulness and your annoying obsession with calligraphy, an obsession that makes no sense to them, and they keep trying to scramble out under the walls of the tent. This doesn't stop you from your writing. You write as if your life depended on it, your life and theirs. You inscribe in shorthand their natures, their features, their habits, their histories. You change the names, of course, because you don't want to create evidence. You don't want to attract the wrong sort of attention to these loved ones of yours, some of whom, you're now discovering, are not people at all, but cities and landscapes, towns and lakes, and clothing you used to wear, and neighborhood cafes and long-lost dogs. You don't want to attract the howlers, but they're attracted anyway, as if by a scent. The walls of the paper tent are so thin that they can see the light of your candle, they can see your outline, and naturally they're curious because you might be prey. You might be something they can kill and then howl over in celebration and then eat one way or another. You're too conspicuous. You've made yourself conspicuous. You've given yourself away. They're coming closer, gathering together. They're taking time off from their howling to peer, to sniff around. Why do you think this writing of yours, this graphomania in a flimsy cave, this scribbling back and forth and up and down over the walls of what is beginning to seem like a prison, is capable of protecting anyone at all, yourself included? It's an illusion, the belief that your doodling is a kind of armor, a kind of charm, because no one knows better than you do how fragile your tent really is. Already there's a clomping of leather-covered feet, there's a scratching, there's a scrabbling, there's a sound of rasping breath. Wind comes in, your candle tips over and flares up, and a loose tent flap catches fire, and through the widening black-edged gap you can see the eyes of the howlers, red and shining in the light from your burning paper shelter. But you keep on writing anyway, because what else can you do? The second piece is a poem that the image comes from something I saw on television. And it was a documentary on an organization called the Grameen Bank, which does microfinancing, started in Bangladesh, for very, very poor women. But one of the things that they have to do, they have to have a little business idea that they can use the money for. And they have to form groups which help the other members, but they also have to learn to write their names. Because these people that the scheme is involving are for the most part not literate at all. So when we say, does writing change anything, we usually view that from the point of view of the writer, people writing books and novels and so forth. But if you take it one level or a couple of levels back and realize that a lot of people in the world can't write at all, just the ability to change from being somebody who can't write to being somebody that can make a huge difference in that person's life, and then in the life of their family, and then in the life of their community. So just being able to write can really change things. This poem is called "A Poor Woman Learns to Write." She squats, bare feet splayed out, not graceful, skirt tucked around ankles. Her face is lined and cracked. She looks old, older than anything. She's probably 30. Her hands also are lined and cracked and awkward, her hair concealed. She prints with a stick laboriously in the wet, gray dirt, frowning with anxiety. Great big letters. There, it's finished. Her first word so far. She never thought she could do this. Not her. This was for others. She looks up, smiles, as if apologizing, but she's not. Not this time. She did it right. What does the mud say? Her name. We can't read it, but we can guess. Look at her face. Joyful flower, a radiant one, sun on water. Thank you.
Thanks. A butterfly flaps its wings in India, and we feel the breeze on our cheeks in New York. A throat is cleared somewhere in Africa, and in California, there's an answering cough. Everything that happens affects something else. So to answer yes to the question before us is not to make a large claim. Books come into the world, and the world is not what it is before those books came into it. The same can be said of babies or diseases. Books, since we are speaking of books, come into the world and change the lives of their authors, for good or ill, and sometimes change the lives of their readers too. This change in the reader is a rare event. Mostly we read books and set them aside, or hurl them from us with great force, and pass on. Yet sometimes there is a small residue that has an effect. The reason for this is the always unexpected and unpredictable intervention of that rare and sneaky phenomenon, love. One may read and like or admire or respect a book and yet remain entirely unchanged by its contents. But love gets under your guard and shakes things up, for such is its sneaky nature. When a reader falls in love with a book, it leaves its essence inside him like radioactive fallout in an arable field. And after that, there are certain crops that will no longer grow in him, while other, stranger, more fantastic growths may occasionally be produced. We love relatively few books in our lives, and those books become parts of the way we see our lives. We read our lives through them, and their descriptions of the inner and outer worlds become mixed up with ours. They become ours. Love does this. Hate does not. To hate a book is only to confirm to oneself what one already knows or thinks one knows. But the power of books to inspire both love and hate is an indication of their ability to make alterations in the fabric of what is. Writing names the world, and the power of description should not be underestimated. Literature remembers its religious origins, and some of those first stories of sky gods and sea gods, not only became the source of an ocean of stories that flowed from them, but also served as the foundations of the world into which they, the myths, were born. There would have been little blood sacrifice in Latin America or ancient Greece if it had not been for the gods. Iphigenia would have lived, and Clytemnestra would have had no need to murder Agamemnon, and the entire story of the house of Atreus would have been different. This would have been bad for the history of the theater, no doubt. But good in many ways for the family concerned. Writing invented the gods and was a game the gods themselves played. And the consequences of that writing, Holy Writ, are still working themselves out today, which just shows that the demonstrable fictionality of fiction does nothing to lessen its power, especially if you call it the truth. But writing broke away from the gods, and in that rupture much of its power was lost. Prophecy is no longer the game, except for futurologists, but then futurology is fiction too. It can be defined as the art of being wrong about the future. For the rest of us, the proper study of mankind is man. We have no priests, we can appeal to no ultimate arbiter, though there are critics among us who would claim such a role for themselves. In spite of this, fiction does retain the occasional surprising ability to initiate social change. Here is the fugitive slave, Eliza, running from Simon Legree. Here is Wackford Squeers' savage head of Dotheboys Hall. Here is Oliver Twist asking for more. Here is a boy wizard with a lightning scar on his forehead, bringing books back into the lives of a generation that was forgetting how to read. Uncle Tom's Cabin changed attitudes towards slavery, and Charles Dickens's portraits of child poverty inspired legal reforms, and J.K. Rowling changed the culture of childhood, making millions of boys and girls look forward to 800-page novels. And improbably popularizing vibrating toy broomsticks and boarding schools. On the opening night of Death of a Salesman, the head of Gimbel's department store rushed from the theater, vowing never to fire his own aging Willy Lomans. In this age of information overkill, literature can still bring the human news, the hearts and minds news. The poetry of Miłosz and Herbert and Szymborska and Zagajewski has done much to create the consciousness, to say nothing of the conscience, of these great poets' time and place. The same may be said of Heaney, Brodsky, Walcott. Nuruddin Farah, so long an exile from Somalia, has carried Somalia in his heart these many years and written it into being, brought into the world's sight that Somalia to which the world might otherwise have remained blind. From China, from Japan, from Cuba, from Iran, literature brings information, the base metal of information, transmuted into the gold of art. And our knowledge of the world is forever altered by such transformational alchemy. This week we honor the memory of Susan Sontag and Arthur Miller, great writers, intellectuals, and truth-tellers. The old idea of the intellectual as the one who speaks truth to power is still worth holding on to. Tyrants fear the truth of books because it's a truth that's in hoc to nobody. It's a single artist's unfettered vision of the world. They fear it even more because it's incomplete, because the act of reading completes it, so that the book's truth is slightly different in each reader's different inner world. And these are the true revolutions of literature, these invisible, intimate communions of strangers, these tiny revolutions inside each reader's imagination. And the enemies of the imagination, politburos, ayatollahs, all the different goon squads of gods and power, want to shut these revolutions down and can't. Not even the author of a book can know exactly what effect his book will have. But good books do have effects, and some of these effects are powerful, and all of them, thank goodness, are impossible to predict in advance. Literature is a loose cannon. This is a very good thing. Thank you.
Hi, welcome back for Act 2. To the extent that the written word is a form of political utterance, it obviously can change something, probably at least 50% of the time for the worse. For every Germinal, there's a Protocols of the Elders of Zion. For every Silent Spring, there's a tract by Rush Limbaugh. if not several. For every communist manifesto, there's the same communist manifesto put to a different use. For me, tonight's question is interesting only as it pertains to really good books, to writers like Jane Austen and Leo Tolstoy, to writing that's too multifaceted or ambivalent or delightful to be socially effective. The question then becomes, can the kind of writing that can't change anything change something? And here, I think, at best, we're talking about very personal and subtle interior changes. I definitely feel as if I've been changed by Austen and Tolstoy. And yet, the more closely I look at the relationship between the self and the words on the page, the more mysterious and tricky things get. So I'm going to read a pair of little stories on the subject of this trickiness by the American fiction writer Lydia Davis. The first one is called Almost No Memory. A certain woman had a very sharp consciousness, but almost no memory. She remembered enough to get by from day to day. She remembered enough to work, and she worked hard. She did good work, and was paid for it, and earned enough to get by. But she did not remember her work, so that she could not answer questions about it when people asked, as they did ask, since the work she did was interesting. She remembered enough to get by and to do her work, but she did not learn from what she did, or heard, or read. For she did read. She loved to read. And she took good notes on what she read, on the ideas that came to her from what she read, since she did have some ideas of her own, and even on her ideas about these ideas. Some of her ideas were even very good ideas, since she had a very sharp consciousness. And so she kept good notebooks and added to them year by year. And because many years passed this way, she had a long shelf of these notebooks, in which her handwriting became smaller and smaller. Sometimes, when she was tired of reading a book, or when she was moved by a sudden curiosity she did not altogether understand, she would take an earlier notebook from the shelf and read a little of it. And she would be interested in what she read. She would be interested in the notes she had once taken on a book she was reading, or on her own ideas. It would seem all new to her. And indeed, most of it would be new to her. Sometimes she would only read and think, and sometimes she would make a note in her current notebook of what she was reading in a notebook from an earlier time. Or she would make a note of an idea that came to her from what she was reading. Other times, she would want to make a note, but choose not to, since she did not think it quite right to make a note of what was already a note, though she did not fully understand what was not right about it. She wanted to make a note of a note she was reading, because this was her way of understanding what she read, though she was not assimilating what she read into her mind, or not for long, but only into another notebook. Or she wanted to make a note because to make a note was her way of thinking this thought. Although most of what she read was new to her, sometimes she immediately recognized what she read and had no doubt that she herself had written it and thought it. It seemed perfectly familiar to her, as though she had just thought it that very day, though in fact she had not thought it for some years, unless reading it again was the same as thinking it again, or the same as thinking it for the first time, and though she might never have thought it again if she had not happened to read it in her notebook. And so she knew by this that these notebooks truly had a great deal to do with her, though it was hard for her to understand and troubled her to try to understand just how they had to do with her, how much they were of her and how much they were outside of her and not of her, as they sat there on the shelf, being what she knew but did not know, being what she had read but did not remember reading, being what she had thought but did not now think or remember thinking, or if she remembered, then did not know whether she was thinking it now or whether she had only once thought it, or understand why she had had a thought once and then, years later, the same thought, or a thought once and then never that same thought again. Then a real tiny little second story. Slightly sunnier, thank you. Slightly sunnier. And as with Margaret, the sunnier thought is shorter. This story is called Happiest Moment. If you ask her what is a favorite story she has written, she will hesitate for a long time and then say it may be this story that she read in a book once. An English language teacher in China asked his Chinese student to say what was the happiest moment in his life. The student hesitated for a long time. At last, he smiled with embarrassment and said that his wife had once gone to Beijing and eaten duck there. And she often told him about it. And he would have to say the happiest moment of his life was her trip and the eating of the duck. Thanks.
Writing made the history of the world. If writing doesn't exist, like gesture, we never know what happened 100,000 years ago. We never got a message from Christ, Socrates, Homer. We even never know what women dressed and undressed in the Middle Age. There's still some tribute in China and in Africa. People don't write and people sing. And in their song, there's not only legend, but it's the law. And nothing can be changed. And every generation have to repeat the same song. Writing is fixed time and thought, and allows the following generation to invent instead of repeat. So I should say, writing doesn't change the world, but writing allows the world to change. The story that I will read happened in the 7th century in China, when my country was the most powerful and vast empire in the world. A girl who loved horses became, in my novel, the first emperor in this world where men ruled like absolute master. So the novel is called The Forbidden Crown, and it will be published soon in the United States. So I will just read the beginning of this incredible life of this girl who had been the most powerful woman in the world. The Forbidden Crown. Endless moons, an opaque universe, thunder, tornadoes, the quaking earth. Rare moments of peace, forehead up against my knees, arms around my mind. I thought, I listened, I longed not to exist. But life was there, a transparent pearl, a star revolving slowly on its own axis. I was blind. My eyes stared to that other world, that other existence which dwindled a little every day. Its colors were extinguished, its images blurred. I was still left with cries of astonishment and a feeble sobbing. I was oppressed by the impotence of these vague recollections, burned by their melancholy. Who am I asked death as it crouched at my feet. Death sighed and gave no reply. Where am I? I could hear laughter. Voices saying, "It will surely be a boy, my lord. He is moving. He is full of life." It mattered little who I would be. I was already weary of this vastness. I was weary of hoping, of waiting, of being myself, the center of the world. I was soothed by the rustle of the wind. I listened to the trickle of rain. Across my sky in which the sun never rose, I could hear a little girl singing. I was lulled by her gentle, innocent voice. "My sister, I feel so great sorrow for her." A hand tried to caress me, but a wall lay between us. "Oh, mother," the shadow outlined against the screen of my thought, "do you realize I'm already old, condemned to live within the prison of your flesh?" In the depths of the lake, in the sepia-colored waters, I swiveled around, curled up into a ball, spread my limbs, turned circles. Day by day, my body grew, weighing heavily on me, strangling me. I would have to be the prick of a needle, a grain of sand, the flash of sunlight in a drop of water. I was becoming flesh, an exploding flesh, a mountain of force and blood, a marine monster. One breath raised me up and rocked me. I was irascible. I was furious with myself, with the woman who was my jailer, with death, my only friend. They waited for me. I heard someone whisper that the boy would be called Heavenlight. The rustle of preparations hampered my meditation. They spoke of clothes, swaddling, celebrations, and white nurses, plump, white, and sturdy. They were forbidden to speak my name for fear that demons would possess my soul. They were waiting for me to pick up where their own destiny had left off. I felt pity for these fervent creatures, so affable, so eager. They did not yet know that I would destroy their world in order to build my own. They did not know that I would bring deliverance, but with fire and ice. One night, I awoke with a start. The waters were seething. Furious waves broke over me. I huddled myself tightly, struggling with my fear and concentrating on breathing, on my gnawing pain. When the tide surged, I was launched to a narrow opening. I slid between the rocks. My body bled. My skin tore, my head imploded. I bore my fist to stop myself screaming. Someone pulled me by my feet and slapped my buttocks. With my head hanging down, my cries spewed from me. I was wrapped in a cloth that flayed me. I heard a man's anxious voice. "Boy or girl?" No one replied. The man grabbed me and tried to tear open my swaddling. He was interrupted by a woman's quiet wail. "Another girl, my lord." "Ah," he cried, before dissolving in tears. A dozen women watched over me as I grew. 3 wet nurses took turns quenching my thirst. My appetite was frightening. I was already laughing. My eyes were great black pearls rolling in their sockets. I looked on the world day and night, never wanting to sleep. My mother was worried by my constant agitation. She called on numbers of exorcist monks, but no one succeeded in expelling the demon from me. I eventually grew weary of their fears. Behind the ghost of my mosquito net, I pretended to sleep to have some peace, where a woman sang as she rocked my cradle. Another waved a fan to waft away the old fly that had strayed into that perfume universe. With my eyelids closed, I let my thoughts fly away. The kingdom which Father ruled as absolute master was divided in 2 parts. The front quarter was reserved for men. Stewards, secretaries, accountants, cooks, pages, valets, grooms, guards, and lackeys busied themselves from the first light of dawn. Government officials took their orders and set off on horseback. Troops of soldiers undertook training exercises all day long in the great courtyard to the side. This burial ward ended before the Crimson Gate, where the gymnasium began. Behind the high, snow-colored wall lived hundreds of women, old, young, little girls. They wore their hair in topknots, pinned with flowers, and had jade rings threaded into their silk belts. It was the 8th year of macho virtue. Fashion favored the pallor of early spring. Dresses were caucus yellow, the soft green of narcissus leaves, the pleasing pink of cherry blossom, the vermilion of the sun reflected in the lake. Sweepers, servants, seamstresses, embroiderers, bearers, wet nurses, cooks, governesses, stewards, casual attendants, singers, dancers, they all moved slowly, with composure, and spoke in hushed tones. They rose at dawn, bathed at dusk. They were the flowers of my father's garden, blossoming in order to compete with the beauty of one person alone. Mother dressed soberly. Her least little cough was a command, her very gaze an order. She was naturally elegant. Fashion changed, a fleeting butterfly. Mother maintained an eternal springtime. She was of the Yang clan from the Hongnon region, one of the 30 most noble families in the empire. As a daughter, niece, sister to eminent ministers, a cousin to imperial pride, and a close relation to emperor and princesses, Mother wore her dignity like a jewel, a cloak, a crown. She gave alms in the monasteries and distributed food to beggars. She was a fervent Buddhist, observing a vegetarian diet and showing no interest in the turmoil of this lowly world. She copied out the sutra in her careful hand and dreamed of reaching the kingdom of extreme joy, the land of Buddha Amida, he who launched countless rays of light. Mother was cold, delicate, soothing. Her gentleness was cutting, opaque, and reminded me of the jade disc that hung over my cradle. I wanted her. I grew agitated waiting. She would appear from time to time after several days' absence. When she arrived, her long silk train and her endless muslin shawl set the curtains in my room a-quiver. The ground, kissed by her slippered feet, whispered with pleasure. Her perfume went before her. It smelled of sunlight, snow, the east wind, flowers laden with happiness. She never took me in her arms, happy to contemplate me from distance. My eyes consumed her angrily. Her lips were two scarlet petals. Her perfect, plucked face was as smooth as a mirror. Beneath her eyebrows, which had been shaved and redrawn in the shape of cicada wings, her eyes betrayed her disappointment. She had desired a boy.
Well, on my first day at school, a teacher, the man who was teaching me and who knew my name, asked me what my name was, and I said I couldn't remember. And I was struck so hard, time and time again, but I insisted I didn't know. And the reason is because I've never liked direct questions. And if somebody comes to me and says to me, "What is your name?" I never remember. And therefore, when I received the question that said, "Does writing change anything?" I said, well, let me read these passages and then ask the audience if writing changes anything. Thank you. The man brought to circumcise me when my turn came made me sit alone, insisting that I read a few Quranic verses of my choice and that I wait for him as he honed the knife he was going to use against a sharp stone he had come along with. I was overcome by fear. Fear of pain, fear of being lonely, fear of being separated forever from Misra. She was not there anyway. Being a woman, she was not allowed to come. And in her place, one of my many uncles came. The sticky saliva in my mouth, the drumming of fright beating in my ears, the numbness of my body, wherever I touched, felt, my legs, my hands, my thighs, my sex. What pain. Then the man asked me to look up at the heavens and to concentrate on anything my eyes fell on. There was an aperture in the clouds, and there was a bird which I spotted, a bird flying high and in haste towards the opening in the heavens. I concentrated on the bird's movements, concentrated on it until it became a dot in the heavenly distance. To mask my fear, I invested all my energy in the look, and the bird's flight reminded me of similar flights of my own fantasies. When I looked again, I could not see the bird. I could only see a tapestry of clouds woven in order to provide the bird with a hiding place. The world, I told myself, was in my eyes, and the bird had flown away with it, carrying it in its beak light as a straw, small as an atom. Now that I had lost sight of the bird, I wasn't sure if it was an eagle or a hawk. There was nothing but sunlight for a long while, and the sun was in my eyes, and it blinded me to the rest of the cosmos. Until the bird re-emerged out of the sun's brightness, beautiful, feminine, playful, and it became again the center of my world, and I was inside of it. In flight, light as are children's fantasies, impervious to the realities surrounding me, and then sudden as bushfire, suck. It is such a horrid territory, the territory of pain. And I crossed it alone, no thought of Misra, no amount of consolatory remarks made by the uncle who had come with me, and no verse of the Quran could have reduced the pain or eliminated it altogether. Do I remember when the pain lodged in my body, which it lived in for almost a month? It entered my groin first, or rather that's what I seem to remember. I recall thinking that I had seen the bird's apparition and that the rest of the world had been small as a speck in the sky. Then the man pulled at the foreskin of my manhood, producing first in my groin, and then in the remaining parts of my body, a pain so acute my ears were set ablaze with dolorous flames. These flames spread gradually, then my feet felt frozen, my eyes warm with tears, my cheeks moist with crying, and my throat dry as the desert. It was only then that I looked and I saw blood, a pool of blood in whose waters I swam and which helped me cross to the other side so I would become a man once and for all. I saw the man break an egg. I could not tell why he did so. Perhaps the idea was to reduce the pain or help stop my losing any more blood. I thought that the white and yellow of the egg mixed well with my own blood, and the colors which I saw, the beauty which I beheld, took the pain away for at least a few decisive seconds. My bare thighs were spotted with cold sprouts of pained hair, and I rubbed them, smoothing the hair erections so the blood would return. I was helped to stand, I couldn't remember by whom, and was led away from the spot I had been sitting on. Possibly the eggshell was the hat my manhood wore, possibly not. Possibly once the skin was pushed back, I was bandaged with cotton or some other similar material, although I cannot remember anything except the pain which made me faint. I awoke alone on a bed. Thank you very much.
Right in front of me, on a crowded subway train, a woman is reading Marcel Proust. I have never seen her before, and most likely I will never see her again after one or the other of us gets off the train. Yet I have the feeling of having met a silent accomplice, someone with whom I share a secret, a hidden treasure. She smiles faintly as she reads, unaware of my looking at her, and remote from the clanking noises of the train, pleasantly alone in spite of the crowd that surrounds her. I recognize this smile on her face and would like to make out which of the volumes of In Search of Lost Time she is reading at the moment. But I don't want to seem obtrusive, even creepy. As I am not in a Latin country, and I have learned that in the US you should not stare at people the same way you could in Spain or Italy. What exactly is prompting her to smile? I can't help wondering. Whom, among the many memorable characters invented by Proust, is she reading about? What faraway place has she been transported to? Paris, or Balbec, or Combray? As the number 6 train rushes downtown, so absorbed in the words written by someone a century ago that she won't even raise her head when the train screeches to a halt at 59th Street. This is the subtle power of the pen, one of them at least. The image of someone reading a novel on a train is more or less commonplace these days. Yet when you come to think of it, it is a kind of miracle as well. At the moment, this woman opened the book and plunged into her reading. Some sort of cosmic yet invisible shift took place, and she is no longer on this train on this workday morning. She has fled, at least partially, to a different country, to a place where she has probably never been. She is surrounded not by sullen, sleepy New York subway riders, but perhaps by the haughty guests at an elegant Parisian dinner. She is living in this present moment between 8:50 and 8:55 a.m., and at the same time in the half-imagined, half-remembered evening Marcel Proust wrote about, and also in the actual time during which Proust was writing, asthmatic, insomniac, pale as a monk in his invalid's bedroom, where day was indistinguishable from night because the thick curtains were always drawn, a dying man trying to put off the end so that he could finish the same novel this lady in front of me reads so effortlessly, even with a smile in her face. Maybe she is finding out some truth about herself. Maybe Proust is influencing her ideas on love or jealousy, is modifying the way she perceives the passing of time or the nature of memory. Had I not read Proust myself, would I be able to notice smells and flavors and sounds the same way I do? Does writing change anything? It is easy to generalize when all these big questions are raised. But as a writer of fiction, I'm not personally fond of general ideas and solemn statements. I see this woman in front of me, and I know how profoundly her actual life is being transformed by the pages of a novel. Like radio waves, the ripples of writing expand invisibly and constantly in all directions, and they are even more powerful because they reach us at our innermost self. You cannot fully read a book without being alone. But through this very solitude, you become intimately involved with people whom you might never have met otherwise, either because they have been dead for centuries or because they spoke languages you cannot understand. And nonetheless, they have become your closest friends, your wisest advisors, the wizards that hypnotize you, the lovers you have always dreamed of. When I was 12, a white-haired novelist who had written in French and had died at the beginning of the 20th century changed my life forever. Reading Jules Verne's novels, I fell under the spell of imaginary worlds, adventures, stories, and characters far beyond the actual experiences of my life, yet more exciting and full of promises than anything my own life could offer me at the time. The world was wider than the small and backward Spanish province I was born in, and the lives I came across in those novels appealed to me far more powerfully than any personal expectation I could figure out for myself. But there was something more for me to learn in those books. The very fact that someone had imagined and written them. This man with a white beard who very soon became a kind of father figure for me, a hero to model my own future after. I would never be a farmer like my father and both my grandparents were. I will not work as a clerk in a store or an office. What this man had done, I would do. Come what may, I would write books. For the last 37 years, I have been trying to fulfill that childish whim. And I don't know whether or not something I have written has brought about a small or enduring change in the life of any of my readers. Judging from my own experience as a reader, there is a maxim I always try to follow. Be careful what you write and how you write, because you never know who might read your words, how and where they are going to resonate. In the late 30s, Cyril Connolly was painfully aware that by writing a couple of lines in an article, he might send a young man to die in the Spanish Civil War. Very often, writers complain bitterly about the futility of their solitary endeavor, but our contemporary world, for better or for worse, was largely created by the writing of at least two self-absorbed graphomaniacs, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Karl Marx. The train has come to a bumpy stop, and at last the lady in front of me raises her eyes from Proust, as if awaking from a pleasant sleep. Now she looks at me, and there is a flash of curiosity and then recognition in her face, as she stealthily takes in the title of the book I am reading, which happens to be Aaron Appelfeld's The Story of a Life. For a second, our eyes meet before I get up and leave the train at 51st Street, two fellow Freemasons exchanging a secret signal in an unfriendly environment, both of us temporary exiles seeking shelter in other people's memories or fictions.
There's been a slight mistake in the program. It says in the document you have that I'll be reading from Taha Jaouch, but that was yesterday. In the program Banned Literature, and I read a chapter from Taha. I wish I'd known earlier, because there were not so many people yesterday. I could get away with reading it again tonight, but what could I do? I take it that we are not speaking merely of what we generally call creative writing. When we talk about writing in this particular context with this question. In other words, we're talking just about writing, literally speaking. And to expand it even further, that by writing we include the unwritten literature of other societies, to which literary critics have given the name orature. Something captured, preserved, augmented, and then transmitted. Words that move beyond the mere utilitarian purpose of daily existence. Now we, the colonized, former colonized, are in no doubt whatsoever about the effect of writing during the anti-colonial struggle, and I'm sure this applies to colonized peoples everywhere, including Americans when they were struggling for their liberation from the British. To seek a parallel in European history for the effect and the impact of literature, the use of literature, writing, one would have to go to the so-called age of Enlightenment in Europe, the great age of pamphleteering. Swift, Defoe, Addison, Steele, Voltaire, etc., especially satiric writing, purpose-directed, unabashedly polemical. Shortest Way with Dissenters, The True-Born Englishman, A Modest Proposal, etc., etc. No one can deny that the pamphleteering writing of that period did make a great impact on the politics and thought of the 18th century, as I had cause to recall during a conference in which I participated quite recently. The change in the attitude, political attitude of England towards Ireland, just to take one small example, was manifested in more ways than one, thanks to the pamphleteering of that period. Indeed, I do lament the passing of that period, or shall we call it street market literature, when pamphlets were virtually hawked in the streets, and the novel, as we know it today, actually began to take shape. A serialization whose next installment was very eagerly awaited, with the rounds of cockles and mussels and hot cross buns. Something of that kind of activity of literature appears to be required today, the age of monumental follies. What other form of literary activity appears to be required for a world that appears to be permanently drunk on the lethal cocktail of rabid fanaticism and fundamentalist lunacy on one side, and ultranationalism, warmongering, and power hypocrisies on the other. And reacquainting myself with those pamphlets, both in my home in Nigeria and way back 2 centuries before our decolonization in Europe, brought me up with a shock. The similarities are really remarkable. But would it also bring others, especially the mad and the powerful, up against a sense of shock also, with the realization of the absurdities and lack of originality, the banal repetitiveness of human miscalculations? Today, it's very, very difficult to tell. I think there's a kind of inoculation of events which has gone on, so it's very difficult to decide. But however, a small corrective anecdote to the kind of pessimism involved in my last remark. It was at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria about 20 years ago, maybe more. The play of mine, Opera Wanyosi, was being performed. Seated in the audience, Opera Wanyosi was an adaptation of Gay's Beggar's Opera and Brecht's Threepenny Opera, and it was during one of these perennial dictatorships. And seated in the audience was a representative of the visitor, that is the head of state himself, a military man. And as the play went on, he got more and more uncomfortable, angry. He was seated next to the vice chancellor, what you call the president here. And finally, he couldn't take it anymore. And he decided to get up and walk out in fury, threatening fire and brimstone on the performers, the writer, the producer, everybody. Well, the vice chancellor was a very persuasive person. He said, well, relax, just sit down, enjoy it. You can do what you want afterwards, but you're representing the head of state. You cannot get up and walk out. So he gritted his teeth and threatened, continued to swear under his breath. Gradually, however, his groans and anger subsided. He became more subdued. And at the end, he sat there for a very long time. He had to be dragged out, more or less. And he then turned to the vice chancellor and he said, you know, it was hard to take, but it's the truth. He was telling the truth. The play has been telling the truth about the conduct of the military in this society. And later on, the dictator himself, we met, and he said, oh, I've heard a report about your play, and I'm thinking of having it brought to Lagos, and I'm going to order all my officers and the sergeant majors to come and watch it. And after all, of course, you realize I'm obliged to lock you all up for as long as necessary. Well, this schizophrenia, he was joking, but a little schizophrenic edge involved. And each dictator differs in schizophrenia from the next. You have to be very careful what methodologies you use. It's obvious, therefore, that when I think of writing, of literature, it is hardly ever as an isolated product. That is, one is conscious of the entire living, dynamic environment of which writing, literature, is only a part, but an important one. And thus, let me say that from the word go, if you were to take this product out of existence, out of society, you'll be left with a very huge hole in that environment. There will be a distortion in consciousness, in reality. It will simply not be the same space of existence. The worst part of it, of course, is that you just do not know, nature abhors a vacuum, you just do not know what would move in to feel literature. It could be dieting, it could be stargazing, it could even be religion. And so, before we dismiss literature as a very unimportant or inessential aspect of human activities, let's be very careful. Could it be simply that this vexatious question which has been posed here simply demands an apportionment of the effectiveness of literature as a contributory factors with others to change? In other words, are we asking the question, what role proportionately did the Invisible Man of Ralph Ellison play in the transformation of racist mentality in comparison to sit-ins in restaurants, the dangerous marches into Mississippi? What proportionate role did they play in the transformation of society and the effect of change? How effective was Baraka, for instance, in relation to the activities of the Black Panther movement in transforming American racial outlook? We're asking the question without the meticulous, unscrupulous, even opportunistic preparation of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, would the entire writings of Marx and Engels have had any impact in creating these seismic changes in world political outlook? We're asking perhaps, was D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's lover responsible for the spread of AIDS? Or was Lolita responsible for the spread of pedophilia in Germany and the United States today? Or did Alan Paton's Cry the Beloved Country, was it a worthless document in comparison to the anti-apartheid struggle, including the use of violent tactics? So these are imponderable questions, and I cannot propose any real response. Change, as we all recognize, is a product of so many forces and pressures, through economic factors to outside, seemingly remote and unconnected events, to direct physical assaults on the status quo. To exclude literature from such an interaction of causative factors would be as unreasonable as to assign literature a preponderant credit for such changes. Literature has always been a socialized event. It will continue to remain one. Writing is a catalyst for change. Beyond that, I'm not prepared to go. But, let's face it, what a beautiful, protean, unpredictable, ecumenical catalyst. Let me describe to you, and here I will quote from something I'd written before, my favorite literary environment. If you've ever strolled along the Seine in Paris, people go to Paris for lots of reasons, of course, and when they get there, they find their own amusements. But if your curiosity or need for exercise does take you along the Seine on a Saturday or Sunday morning, especially, when the city's breath is just beginning to animate those narrow streets, cafes, and shops, you will observe a number of wooden kiosks, permanent features of the embankment. They've all been padlocked all night, very much like our own upright kiosks, which you'll find if you visit Nigeria. You stroll along the Dugbe market in Ibadan, Itabalogun in Lagos, and their equivalent in Abuja, Enugu, and Kano. They are protected against sabotage of all the elements by plastic or other forms of improvised waterproofing, held down with stones and blocks, iron rods, or some kinds of discarded lumps of iron. They will open in the morning to a display of all kinds of bric-a-brac awaiting customers. However, many of these kiosks, and certainly those which you will find along the Seine, those flat-topped wooden derelict-looking boxes covered in tarpaulin and thin metal sheets, by the time your stroll takes you along the Seine and you're on your way back to your hotel, what a transformation. Their custodians have emerged. individuals who appear to have levitated from a lower level of the embankment, morose-looking figures. They drag on their Gulwa cigarettes and look as if they're in desperate need of an espresso coffee. Then they open the lids of these ancient, truly and literally weather-beaten, coffee-stained boxes, and behold what merchandise has been lurking within those nondescript kiosks. Books, writings, documents of all sorts, from the most ancient to the most modern, Montesquieu to Omar Khayyam, to Confucius, to Marx and Engels, to Jean-Paul Sartre, all the way down to the cheapest of pamphlet publications that you'd hope to find anywhere in similar markets of the world, from Samarkand, as I said, to Abuja, and so on. I find those walks my favorite literary environment, far much more interesting and fascinating than even bookshops, the most clinical, beautifully arranged, categorized, bookshops anywhere you'll find in the streets of the United States. But there's something even more fascinating about some of those books. Several of the pages are still uncut. It's as if the publisher, bookseller, was saying to you, look, what is within these pages is worth some effort by you. So it's a value, a revelation, they're saying to you, which money cannot buy. So put in a little bit of labor and do your own cutting. And so those who understand the processes of printing, of course, will understand how these pages came to be exactly like that. Even some of the most beautifully technologically produced books these days, fortunately, there's still a few who maintain that tradition. But generally, everything is page by page. Now, for some of us perverse consumers of the printed word, it is no setback, no problem. You purchase one of those books, you have the exquisite pleasure of settling down to them as if with a fork and knife. And it's truly as if you're eating your way through the book, slitting through the bonded pages, several pages ahead, or, depending on your temperament, twin page by twin page as you progress. As a matter of fact, for those of us who are somewhat retarded in the language in which the books have been published, cutting through one page after the other prevents us getting sudden constipation. Let me just end by my favorite image also, just as that is my favorite literary environment in any city I go to. It's an image which is adapted with the posthumous permission of our universal bard and writer, William Shakespeare. I know he was writing about Cleopatra, but in reality I think he was thinking about his own profession, which was writing. And it's for me an expression, a summation of the beauty of literature. And I wasn't around at the time, but I think Shakespeare was really thinking about literature and books when he wrote, "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety." That's all. Thank you.